I'm not sure if people can just see you though, or if the spotlight is on the speaker.
I'm seeing a screen that says after the moratorium. And so,
Okay, well, anyway, I'll just start. I hope you can see me. I'm Judge Erica Yu. We are letting people in right now, and we're really excited to be doing this. I'm a judge in Santa Clara County Superior Court, along with Panita Johnsa. We chair the Racial Justice and Intersectionality Committee of the California Access to Justice Commission, and we welcome you to this symposium. We know that everyone is extremely busy and overly Zoomed these days, so we're just grateful for your participation. I just want to make sure that we have people coming in from the waiting room, and I have some announcements. So as you're coming in, you may have, as I did, use the link that we got at 8 o'clock this morning, and that makes you come in as Jasmine. If you wouldn't mind changing to your actual name, that will help us. If you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat. Ms. Johnson and I, as the hosts of this symposium and as the chair of this committee, will be monitoring and moderating. So we'll make sure to try to work your questions into the discussion, but we also have a question and answer section built into this. So I'm going to ask if we can please display the slide now that has the agenda, because as you'll see, the agenda is set for, we're going from 12:30 to 2:30. And I believe that Jasmine will be able to bring up the agenda at this point. And so you'll see the various speakers. It's a very full agenda, but we also want to make sure that this kind of keeps moving, and you'll see all the various topics we're going to be talking about. I also do want to let you know that this session is being recorded, and thank you, Ms. Fiber, or Mr. Fiber, or Ms. Fiber for asking. And it looks like change the name is not an option to some people, so don't worry about it. If it's not an option, it's okay. We know you have a legitimate link, and we're just trying to make sure we don't have any Zoom bombers. So as I said, this will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the Access to Justice's website, along with the materials that we'll be talking about and the speaker bios. We will be introducing our speakers, but it'll be sort of brief introduction, because we know that you can look at the bios. In addition, an evaluation will be emailed to all the registrants after the participation and your presentation, along with information if you want to ask for MCLE credits. So we have quite a few people here, and we know that people hail from many different organizations and job classifications. So we wanted to put up a short poll, and we're asking you to select the choice that best describes your work in this area. And while we're doing that, I have some information to share. So as you can see, the poll is asking if you could just click on what it is that you're doing in this field, because we definitely want to cater and customize our comments to your needs. And again, if you have any questions, please make sure to put it in the chat, and you can chat them to me, to Judge Kolakowski or Jasmine, or Ms. Ronsa. And thank you. So while the people are responding to the poll, let me just share some information to set the stage. As you know, this symposium is focused on what are we going to do after the moratorium. And there's going to be a lot of issues that crop up in handling unlawful detainer cases, but we really wanted to focus on the issue of bringing an anti-racist lens to handling these cases. Of course, both landlords and tenants are suffering during this pandemic. Landlords are suffering with no rental income. They're unable to make payments on their obligations. They have decreasing rents and increasing vacancies, and so that impacts, their financial survival. But since this symposium is focused on handling unlawful detainer cases through an anti-racist lens, our discussion will necessarily focus on the segment of the community that is experiencing racial inequities. And so according to Zillow, Black and Latinx households are twice as likely to rent as white households. And as such, much of our discussion will center upon tenants. But the principles and techniques that we're going to discuss and share will apply equally to both tenants and landlords. Now, nobody really knows how large the tidal wave of evictions will be once the moratoriums are lifted, but the Aspen Institute estimates that 4 to 5 million Californians, or 1.8 to 2.3 million California households, are at risk of eviction presently. This compares to information from 2016, 2017, 2018, that there was an average of 166,000 evictions filed annually in California. So it's really just mind-boggling to think that we're going to go from approximately 166,000 evictions annually to potentially 1.8 to 2.3 million evictions filed. So the August 7, 2020 Aspen Institute report also states that studies from cities throughout the country have shown that people of color, particularly Black and Latinx people, constitute approximately 80% of the people who are facing eviction. And according to the June 1st, 2020 Economic Policy Institute report, Black workers have a higher rate of unemployment, not to mention the wage gap between Black and white workers. Black households are less likely to have multiple earners, they have fewer cash reserves, and they're more likely to be frontline workers, essential workers, so they're more exposed to health risks, they have fewer paid sick days, and a higher rate of death if they contract COVID-19. So our discussion is going to explore how can we ease this eviction process for people who are suffering from racial trauma, financial stress during this pandemic. So why don't we take a look at the poll results at present? We can post the poll results. And I think we have, I think you can see that. So it looks like we're 30% tenant attorney, about 30% legal aid staff, not that much in terms of people who are representing landlords. So we might have hit the sweet spot of this being something that is going to be useful to our audience. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Jack London. He's the Executive Director of the California Access to Justice Commission. He's also a partner with the San Francisco office of Morrison and Foerster. For 39 years, he's been with the firm, and he's combined his commercial litigation practice with a wide range of really laudable pro bono work on impact cases and cases that serve individuals and nonprofit organizations. In pro bono cases, he has co-led in the Williams versus California case, which added resources and improved accountability for K through 12 schools statewide in California. He's got a sterling bio, and that can be found in more detail on the commission's website. So Jack.
Hello, everyone. The California Access to Justice Commission was one of the first access commissions in the United States. Before that, the Federal Legal Services Corporation had been the main engine for innovation for civil justice. Politics got in the way of the LSC, and in addition, access commissions realized there are many different ways to enhance access to justice and many constituencies who should participate. Since we focus on the state or local level, innovation is more feasible and can be more effective. Some examples of the California Commission's accomplishments are that we were among the very first in the United States to focus on limited scope legal representation, to get that recognized as a valid way of practicing and to do it ethically and competently. We also were instrumental in obtaining general fund money for the Equal Access Fund in California. The Access Commissioners are lawyers, judges, professors, librarians, business people, representatives of labor and nonprofit staffers, and more. But judges always have been and remain especially committed, as you will see in this program. After 23 years of being affiliated directly with the State Bar of California, the Access Commission became an independent nonprofit public benefit corporation 1 year ago. We have a new website where you can find many reports, studies, publications, and other information about civil justice. It's at calatg.org. On our website, you can find our new Justice Map application. It displays resources available everywhere in California, and gaps that we need to fill in the civil justice system for people who cannot afford to pay for legal representation. As you will see when you look at the justice map, rural areas have been underserved, and our Rural Access Committee has published a series of reports on problems, needs, and potential solutions. With COVID-19, has come a new way for courts to do business using remote hearings. In May, the Access Commission issued a remote hearings guide for courts on how to do a better job for people who don't have internet access, who speak other languages, and who are unfamiliar with technology. Our guide's being widely used in California and in other states. This symposium is an early project of our newest committee on racial justice and intersectionality. The committee's members are highly engaged in spreading awareness of how participants in the civil justice system can do better at respecting the dignity of all people they encounter. If you're not clear about what intersectionality means or what an anti-racist perspective has to do with civil justice, you come to the right place for today's program. For Dr. Terrence Roberts, the experience of racial injustice was early and severe. At 16 years old, he was one of the 9 Black students who integrated Little Rock Central High School in his hometown in Arkansas. The Little Rock 9 experienced resistance so severe that President Eisenhower mobilized the National Guard to protect them. After Little Rock closed its high schools in 1958, he and his family moved to Los Angeles for his senior year. He's lived in California for many years. Dr. Roberts has a PhD in psychology. He is an educator, a consultant on the management of human capital. His clients have included businesses, government agencies such as the FBI and the IRS, universities, and nonprofit organizations. In 1979, he confronted Governor Orville Faubus on ABC's Good Morning America television program. He argued that Faubus had violated the public trust by his segregationist policies. Dr. Roberts became department chair of Antioch University, Los Angeles psychology program in 1994. He again made an appearance on the Oprah Winfrey Show when he and other members of the Little Rock 9 met with some of the same white students who tormented them in Little Rock Central High, and they made their peace. In 1998, the Little Rock School District hired Dr. Roberts as their official desegregation consultant. He has continued to provide similar services throughout the United States for many years. Dr. Roberts has written many essays, given many lectures, published books entitled Simple Not Easy and Lessons from Little Rock. Let me add that he and the 8 others who integrated Little Rock Central High School received the Congressional Gold Medal from President Clinton to recognize their courage and their service to our country. The Access Commission is grateful that Dr. Terrence Roberts is participating in today's program. He will keynote the program with observations on challenges facing courts, lawyers, and litigants who must find a way to treat each other with respect while maneuvering through the upcoming avalanche of eviction proceedings. I know you'll find his remarks to be insightful and valuable, and let me now turn the screen over to Dr. Terrence Roberts.
Well, thank you very much, Jack. And thank you, Judge Yu, for your remarks. As I listened to you open this seminar, this session, I thought she's giving a great intro for my paper. The paper I've entitled today, Racism and the Eviction Process, in keeping with our theme about looking at the process through an anti-racist lens. And so in a few minutes, I will start that report or essay that I've written. It's short, actually, won't take up that much time. But basically, I'm going to talk about the real problem with trying to do what we're doing for people who are in the frame to be evicted. How can we do that given the history that sort of sets them up for that? Well, in any case, we'll see how that goes. You know, when you think about human needs, food, clothing, shelter, these three items appear without fail at the top of most credible scales of basic human needs. In an ideal world, there would be little argument that all humans deserve access to these life-giving, life-affirming commodities. The world we occupy, unfortunately, is less than ideal. In our world, food, clothing, and shelter belong first and foremost to those who can afford to pay the going market rate. That's a hallmark of who we have become. If you can pay, you can have. If you cannot pay, you cannot have. Well, that's a simplistic way of looking at it, of course, but I think you get the picture. Now, this is not the only possible way of structuring a society. There are many ways we could do that, but this is the way we have chosen to do it. In our part of the world, particularly, our emphasis is placed in large measure on honoring the ersatz virtues of individualism, objectivity, meritocracy, and exclusion, just to name a few of the mythological constructs we so highly value. In so doing, we miss the opportunity to learn enough about the more eternal values of justice, mercy, compassion, cooperation, and inclusion. Years ago, I happened to pick up a book written by Ernest Becker, a social anthropologist. The book entitled The Birth and Death of Meaning. And in that book, he had this very poignant sentence. The task of culture is to provide every single individual with the firm conviction that he or she is an object of primary value in a world of meaningful action. And I remember when I first read those words, and I've read them many times since, when I first read those words, my thought was, culture has failed. Culture has failed me. Culture has failed us. But since that time, I have not changed my assessment. Now, that is, in my estimate, quite an indictment of our culture, and yet the reality stands. And not only have we failed miserably in this process, we have added racism to the mix to create a culture so imbalanced that even those among us who wish to change things for the better find it virtually impossible to find a starting point. The quest for these would-be change agents is further complicated by the strength of the opposition, who collectively find the status quo perfectly fine, nothing wrong with it. And plus, they are willing to fight hard against any attempt to alter it. In his 1967 novel, The Fixer, Bernard Malamud has this to say: in a sick country, any sign of health is an insult to those who live off the sickness. How have we arrived at such an untenable position? To understand fully, we must review the historical record. We must trace the steps we have taken and the roads we have trod to get from there to here. In deference to our mutual addiction to clock time, I'm going to start a timeline in the year 1619, an appropriate starting point for us as we look at this eviction process through a lens of anti-racism, because in 1619, we see racism already full-blown. This is a year that the very first shipload of people from Africa were transported to these shores to begin a process of donating labor to a cause from which they would not reap any benefits. Lifetime enslavement, simply because that's the way we decided to do things. Upon the Black bodies of these men, women, and children were placed the burden of securing the fortunes and the futures of millions of so-called white people in this country. Race, the bastard child of racism, was used as a line of demarcation between we the people and others. Thus, the die was cast. Henceforth, the race of people deemed Black were considered ineligible to coexist as fellow human beings alongside those who saw them merely as property to be bought, sold, and used at will at any time in any way. Centuries go by. In 1896, 277 years after our start date of 1619, we find the United States Supreme Court sitting and hearing the arguments in the case of Homer Plessy versus Ferguson, the case known more generally as Plessy v. Ferguson. They ruled in that case that it was indeed constitutional to discriminate against Black people. Constitutional. The rule of law was invoked to underscore and highlight an already accepted point of view, accepted by the majority of people who call themselves American citizens. Now, to get a more complete picture of this use of law to support social, legal, educational, housing, healthcare, and economic policy, I invite you to look at Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Ironically, in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case that it was no longer constitutional to discriminate against Black people. Now we can pause here for those of you who are constitutional scholars or perhaps wannabe. How can it be that the Constitution supports discrimination in 1896, but does not support it in 1954? Well, I'll leave it to you to resolve that one. So 335 years after our starting point, we find the court ruling that discrimination is no longer constitutional. But let's pause and take a look at the timeline from 1619 to 1954, as I said, is 335 years. Think about that. I want you to consider the weight of 335 years and what that truly means to us. If we have dedicated ourselves to an ideology of racism starting in 1619, and then the law changes in 1954, that means for those 335 years nonstop, with the full weight of and social custom supporting this, what chance have we in the year 2020? You see, because even in 1954, when the law was changed, nothing else changed with it. The law did change, and let's mark that down as being very significant. The law changed, but nothing changed with it. Things social, cultural, economic, ideological, psychological, all of that remained in place, which, by the way, accounts for the madness we see swirling around us in this 21st century we're in. Wow. As I think about that, I have to fight against my own feelings of hopelessness and despair. But I don't want to preach hopelessness and despair to you, because without hope, we have no chance of changing any of this. Well, since 1954, we've seen fits and starts in the direction of change, but in the main, we remain dedicated to the status quo we so proudly hailed back in 1896. For centuries, Black people in America were denied by law the right to own real property. Home ownership, the primary method by which most American families establish a base of wealth, was not available to Black people. And even after the law was changed, permitting them to own property, custom decreed that it shall not be so if we can make it happen. And so we have redlining and districting and a whole lot of other ways and means of making sure that even though the law supported Black ownership of homes, they could not and would not be allowed to do so. Well, in reviewing Matthew Desmond's searing monograph, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American Society, American City, a correspondent from the New Republic writes these words: "A shattering account of life on the American fringe, Matthew Desmond's Evicted shows the reality of a housing crisis that few among the political or media elite ever think much about, let alone address. It takes us to the center of what would be seen as an emergency of significant proportions if the poor had any legitimate political agency in American life. One role we have in this forum today is to learn how to speak on behalf of the voiceless poor people who live on the fringes of our society. We can direct our words to those who hold positions of power and authority. We can, by our actions, confront the afflicted even as we afflict the comfortable. We can care enough to confront those who act as if the past has no relevance to the conditions of poor people of color. As members of this society, it is our duty to provide assistance to those who cannot meet their own needs for housing as an indirect consequence of their forebears being forbidden by law and by custom to acquire the means of doing so. The fundamental rule of law is straightforward. The fundamental rule of law regarding eviction is quite clear. If you cannot meet the payment, you must vacate the premises. California Assembly Bill 3088 is a stopgap measure designed to mitigate the impact of the fundamental rule of law. It is likely that many will see this as humane and caring, that the state of California is truly concerned about the plight of poor people and the people who rent houses to them. And perhaps this is so. What is missing from this scenario is any inkling of understanding about how these situations came to be. What we do know is that poor people, especially poor Black people, have never fared very well in American courts of law. Eviction has been named as one of the consequences of poverty, but I am convinced that eviction is much more a cause than a consequence. Wrapped as it is in the tentacles of capitalism, eviction is a tool used by landlords to ensure that their flow of revenue is not interrupted by whatever unfortunate circumstances might befall a given family of renters. And if the safety nets available to the families facing such consequences are inadequate, the full burden falls squarely on the shoulders of those least able to extricate themselves from the nefarious circumstances. In truth, the major problem we face is not eviction per se, but the crucible in which this mechanism has been allowed to grow and develop. Now, if we are to have a system, a society in which some are owners and others are renters, we must have a social contract that guarantees that both owners and renters are able to meet their symbiotic obligations. An unfortunate truth is that we have allowed greed and avarice to dictate our response to meeting basic needs of all kinds. A glaring example of this is found in healthcare. My considered opinion is that healthcare should never, ever have been a part of the market economy. It would have been better placed as a utility. Considering the efficacy of maintaining as healthy as possible a population, why wasn't healthcare made available in the same way we receive water, electricity, or natural gas? Is it not just as, or perhaps even more essential than these three? Our discussion about ways to mitigate the eviction crises looming on the horizon must include a consideration of the overarching policies that undergird our approach to the least among us. Those who reside at the apex of the socioeconomic triangle have few worries about meeting basic needs. But those who fill the bottom rungs spend all of their waking time and a lot of their sleeping time searching for ways to find food, clothing, and shelter. It's difficult for the fortunate few to empathize with the hungry, homeless masses, since our use of self as barometer for the condition of all others provides a rather skewed measurement. This is aggravated further when the lens of self is clouded by the overlay of racism. But don't take my word as gospel. Read the reports, sift through the statistics, spend time talking to those facing eviction, increase your fund of information about those less fortunate than yourselves, and be willing to pose hard questions to those who have the power and the authority to alter eviction outcomes. I invite you to consider your own power, especially the power of your imagination. In his very compelling book, The Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann invites us to consider replacing the static imperialism of order and triumph with the politics of justice and compassion. According to Brueggemann, we can make this switch if we are able first to imagine a new reality. Once imagined, it's a matter of finding the will and the commitment to do whatever it takes to bring it to fruition. For long, dark centuries, we have lacked the will and the commitment to face the truth about ourselves. We have witnessed the country sliding ever closer to the edge of oblivion without considering the karmic price we will have to pay for hiding behind the translucent doors of willful ignorance about racial injustice while paying homage to the gods of greed, avarice, and selfishness. We do not come to this potential eviction tsunami without advance warning. The signposts have been there. The directional signals have flashed their caution lights, but we have ignored this clarion call to action. Now we face a day of reckoning. The current national administration has made it clear that further aid to remedy the dislocations fomented by COVID-19 is not a high priority. It appears that the prevailing thought is every man for himself. Where does that leave us in the state of California? It is untenable to suggest that end AB Bill 3088 beyond January 2021. But we can do whatever we can do to alter the makeup of the national government. On November 3rd, we have an opportunity to do just that. My advice, carpe diem. You and I both know that the most likely outcome of this process as it plays out in California will mean that some evictees will comply with the bureaucratic demands of AB 3088, and they will suffer through the crisis with minimal additional trauma. Others will be unable to comply based on their own unique personal circumstances, and they will add yet another layer of trauma. All who are directly impacted by this experience will need as much compassion as we can muster. Words of comfort, words of explanation, words sincerely spoken. All of these words will serve to ease the feelings of despair and hopelessness. Anything that can be done to help this group of people navigate the bureaucratic maze will be more than helpful. That said, it would be irresponsible of me not to make note of today's socio-cultural climate, which includes a large number of citizens and elected officials who believe that racism is an artifact of some warped thinking on the part of a few individuals who lived in our distant past. A recent executive order signed by the president entitled Executive Order on Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping contains distorted and untruthful information about racial diversity training programs offered to governmental employees. The order instructs all department heads to cease and desist any training activities related to racial diversity and to submit future plans for appropriate training in this area for review by designated officers. The tenor of the order is that all issues related to the oppression of people of color in this country have been resolved. Ergo, no need to beat that particular drum. The Civil War is referenced in this order as having had the effect of eliminating the ideology of racism. Given this state of affairs, it is quite likely that even your efforts on behalf of the tenants and landlords will be scrutinized to some extent as being based on faulty assumptions. We are living in strange times indeed. That reality is unlikely to change anytime soon, but your task remains the same. Learn to navigate this terrain armed with the most sophisticated GPS systems you can find. A system that will assist you in discovering how racism is manifested and how it impacts those who are targeted. A system that will need recalibration from time to time as you become more attuned to the nuances of this ideology. Now, in closing these brief remarks, I'd like to share with you these words from The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. Those of you who have heard me speak or have read any of my writings know that I will often reference something written by this man. He says, "Oftentimes, I've heard you speak of one who commits a wrong as though he were not one of you, but a stranger unto you and an intruder upon your world. But I say unto you that even as the holy and the righteous cannot rise beyond the highest which is in each one of you, so the wicked and the weak cannot fall lower than the lowest which is in you also. And as a single leaf turns not yellow, but with the silent knowledge of the whole tree, so the wrongdoer cannot do wrong without the hidden will of you all. Like a procession, you walk together towards your God self. You are the way and the wayfarers. And when one of you falls down, he falls for those behind him, a caution against the stumbling stone. Aye, and he falls for those ahead of him who, though faster and sure of foot, yet removed not the stumbling stone." And so, take to heart those words. If we have the power to remove the stone, by all means, do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts. We so appreciate your words and your guidance and leadership. For our audience, Dr. Roberts will join one of the panel discussions later this afternoon. And also he referenced AB 3088, and Bonnie Huff will talk later this afternoon about the Judicial Council tools to help us address the requirements in AB 3088. Now I'd like to introduce my co-chair, Panita Johnsa. She is the Directing Attorney, Human Rights Advocacy, Legal and Housing Council at the Thai Community Development Center. She has been working with Thai victims of human trafficking since 2007. At the Thai Community Development Center, she oversees all direct social and legal services and provides those services herself as well. In addition to her work combating human trafficking, Ms. Johnsa has been involved with both labor and housing rights advocacy. She's a HUD certified a certified housing counselor, providing counseling to members of the Thai community with limited English proficiency. And I'd also like to introduce Ms. Nisha Vyas. She's a senior attorney with the Western Center on Law and Poverty, which is a statewide organization that advocates for low-income Californians in the area of housing, health, and public benefits, as well as economic justice. The Western Center also serves as a support center for legal services programs across the state. With a background in fair housing and community development, Ms. Vyas focuses on promoting housing stability through advocacy and litigation with a racial justice and racial equity lens. They're going to be sharing some information, statistics, and client stories so that we have a full understanding of what is facing tenants currently in these times.
Thank you, Erica, for that wonderful introduction. And we would like to share our PowerPoint at this time, if that's possible.
I think Jasmine's got it.
Perfect. And thank you for the warm introduction as well. I'm so glad to have had the honor to be introduced and to present with Ms. Vyas, who I've worked with for many years, but have never presented with. So I'm super excited to be here and very excited to see that we have so many people joining our symposium today.
Yes, thank you so much, Judge Yu, for the warm introduction. Thank you. So honored to be with everyone today. Thank you, Panita, for asking me to join you. If we can have the next slide, please. I think it's really important for us to briefly do a land acknowledgement, especially as we're talking a lot about property and shelter and, the politics of exclusion. Although we are meeting virtually, we want to acknowledge and recognize that each of us is situated on the traditional land of Indigenous people. For example, the place where I live is a traditional land of the Tongva, Chumash, and Kizh people. I want to honor their history, their present, and their future as stewards of this land. And we want to encourage you to explore resources such as this website that's noted on this PowerPoint, native-land.ca, as a good starting point for learning more about the Indigenous stewards of the land in which you reside. Next slide, please. So prior to COVID-19, California was already in crisis. Housing costs, particularly for low-income Californians, were already unsustainable. According to the Homelessness Policy Research Institute at USC, homelessness in California increased by more than 22% over the last decade. Between 2018 and 2019, homelessness in California increased by over 16%. Black and African American and Indigenous people, including Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, and other Asian Pacific Islander groups, are overrepresented in the California population of unhoused people. Black people have experienced overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, in housing segregation, and employment discrimination, which have led to their disproportionate representation in the unhoused population. And contrary to the persistent myth that the unhoused people are from outside of our state looking for better weather, it turns out that the vast majority of people who have been displaced are from the very communities in which they are now trying to survive on the streets. Can we have the next slide, please? I want to provide some statistics from Los Angeles County as an example, as one obviously very enormous, significant region of our state that I think is illustrative of the problem. So in Los Angeles County, there is a shortage of over 500,000 affordable housing units. Why is that significant? Because over 58% of renters, it's well over half of renters, are cost burdened, which means that they're paying more than 30% of their household income on housing costs. And that includes that 79% of extremely low income households paying more than half of their income on housing. In fact, 600,000 people living in Los Angeles County households are paying 90% or more of their income in rent. That sounds wild. Like, how are you paying for clothing or food? Well, oftentimes the rent eats first. And so people are trying to hold on to their housing and going hungry and going without basic needs in order to be able to do that. The 2020 Greater Los Angeles homeless count shows over 66,000 people in the county are unhoused, and that number is growing. That is actually a pre-COVID-19 number. This count happened in January of 2020 of this year. Obviously 2020 is this year. Next slide, please. So, I'm so grateful for Dr. Roberts and Judge Yu setting the stage for our conversation today. I want to reiterate what they've raised about the idea about the fact that we have racialized property interests, and that is a result of the history of this country and this state. Numerous policies and their implementation have historically functioned to exclude people of color from land ownership, which has left rental housing as their primary housing option. These policies include the Homestead Act of 1862, the racialized implementation of the GI Bill, the Federal Housing Administration's lending policies of redlining, kept federal financing from communities of color, racially restrictive covenants, and exclusionary zoning. And a lot of our housing policy is just built on this foundation, right? So I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that. So consequently, people of color today, and other historically marginalized groups are more likely to rent their homes than white households. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Panita to
Thanks.
talk about this
So
next section.
this is just part of the story that we've heard so far, because now we have COVID to deal with. And as everybody knows, you've heard in the news about, job loss, economic hardship. A lot of the Black and Brown communities are hit harder in a lot of different ways, not just COVID, but job loss and economic hardship. And right now, a lot of the legal aid organizations, community-based organizations, other agencies are trying to mobilize statewide to try to get assistance for those communities that are being hit hard. But by bringing us all together today, we want to be better prepared, even though we all know that homelessness and housing disparities have already existed. It just really exacerbates what's happening by being in a pandemic right now. Next slide. So I wanted to throw these numbers up here just to kind of remind folks that we are looking at one indicator in terms of unemployment, just to, we want to note that it's not really the whole picture. There's a lot of people, especially in Black and Brown communities, that are not eligible for unemployment benefits. Fortunately, in the state of California, it's been expanded. And, I read in one news article that upwards of 8 million people had applied for unemployment benefits since March. And I don't think those numbers are going down. The state is starting to reopen slowly, but everything is different as we know it. Next slide.
Is it back to me? Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. I apologize. So Black and Brown households are experiencing more economic insecurity, to borrow a phrase that's been misused. According to the Pew Research Center, 61% of Latinx Americans and 44% of Black Americans reported that they or someone in their household experienced job or wage loss due to the pandemic, compared to 38% of white Americans. And that was actually a study or a survey completed in April of this year. So the picture is likely more dire at this stage. With the next slide, please. We talk about the racialized impacts. I think in terms of referencing intersectionality and talking about other categories that we name for folks who are or communities that are historically marginalized and vulnerable. They're all at heightened risk. And the reason for that is that they were at heightened risk prior to the pandemic, and now they're just completely at the edge. So, for example, people with disabilities have historically higher rates of unemployment than the general population. We live in an ableist society. LGBTQ people are at high risk of eviction and homelessness. And I want to particularly emphasize that transgender, non-binary people of color are at high risk of eviction and homelessness because of discrimination, because of violence on their bodies, because of discrimination in employment. Undocumented immigrants often do not qualify for unemployment insurance or receive stimulus checks. There's been some attempts to assist households, but in general, that is the case, particularly for many federal funds. And households with children are among the most vulnerable to eviction due to inability to pay rent. Children are, again, as I mentioned before, because the rent eats first, oftentimes you're seeing children going hungry, losing learning opportunities, losing educational opportunities as a result of the risk of eviction and evictions themselves. May I have the next slide, please? So obviously COVID-19 has impacted housing stability. I think we've heard it phrased as a tsunami of evictions is coming. Sometimes there's like an earthquake. Some people say earthquake. We use a lot of these terms to talk about the magnitude of the crisis, these kind of natural disaster terms, but there's nothing natural about this disaster, right? This is a man-made, this is a preventable disaster. But what we have from the fallout of COVID-19 has pulled millions of Californians to the edge of an eviction cliff. I guess I'm just using other metaphors, but just really trying to give you the gravity of the crisis. May I have the next slide, please? So, I think these numbers are slightly different from the numbers that Judge Yu cited earlier, but really, estimates are clear in that the expectation is that millions of renter households may be unable to pay rent and at risk of eviction in the state of California. And we're not talking about tens of thousands, we're not talking about 100,000, we're talking about millions. Over 36% of households with children had slight or no confidence in their ability to pay the next month's rent. And the proportion of Latinx renter households are at risk of eviction at much higher rates than among the white renter population. And to illustrate, I've thrown a lot of numbers at you. We've talked a lot about this, so I'm going to turn it over to Panita to talk about how this has impacted one of Thai CDC's clients.
Thank you, Nisha. Next slide. Now, I wanted to share a story today about one of my clients who was afraid to put herself in the spotlight on camera, on a recording, but she did write a letter that I'd like to read. And once, after I read the letter, I'll kind of go over what happened in her story, but I wanted to share her voice today because I think that a lot of people who are facing, these inequities are not able to voice themselves in a way where they are heard or they're afraid to. But I'm going to go ahead and read this, and I'll talk you through it a little bit more. So it starts, "This is the real story that happened to me after COVID-19 pandemic. I rent one apartment in Los Angeles for 7 years. Normally I pay rent on time. Sometimes I pay late. I have to pay rent plus the late fee. I got laid off from my waitress job on March 16th, 2020 because of COVID-19. After that, I applied to do a delivery driving job to survive. I drive my car to work around 5.5 months now. My car broke. I had to rent a car, and that's a lot of money. It makes me not able to afford rent in September and October. I talked to the landlord a few times about being short of money and told him that I'm willing to pay him ASAP. The landlord and manager told me that I had already paid late. I wasn't allowed to do laundry, and they have other expenses too, like water and electricity. And so now I'm too scared to do laundry in the building, so I do laundry somewhere else. I talked to the landlord by phone and told him I didn't understand why I couldn't do laundry. I explained why I couldn't make enough money and that I wanted to pay. And he said that he said that I have a job and I need to pay rent. I still work. October 11th, my landlord put a paper at my apartment door. I called him and asked what the paper means. He said I had to pay rent within 3 days or move out, or he'd kick me out, that no one's ever late like me. I can sleep on the street or sleep in my car. I felt very mad, upset, and insecure. I wrote a letter to him, put it in his mailbox after that. After that, I missed a call from him. I texted him back to say that he could text me because I was working, but he never texted again. I talked to him by phone last time. I said he shouldn't shout at me, chase me, and force me. It's against the law. So this letter is a letter that was written by someone that speaks Thai as a first language. And there are little grammatical errors here and there that I had to kind of work around. But I just wanted to talk about how this particular individual was really, facing tough times because she was a waitress and lost her job because of COVID. Once she was able to find a delivery driving job, her car broke down. So she had all these car repair bills that she couldn't afford, had to start renting a car to pay her expenses. And, her expenses are actually more than what she makes, what she brings in. So she has to choose between buying her food, medicine, or paying rent, right? And it's really a tough decision because when there are landlords that harass and shout and curse and threaten to do terrible things, she basically called me and said, is he going to lock me out? Is he going to come into my apartment? Like she was actually scared for her physical safety because she didn't know what the laws were. And she didn't know what the papers were that he had delivered to her. But he didn't explain it. So toward the end of this statement, she said she wrote a letter. So I had coached her through writing a letter so that he knew that because of COVID, she was not able to pay rent, but she would like to pay rent as soon as she possibly can. And I think some landlords might not be giving the notices that are mandated by law. And so there's a lot of misinformation in the community, especially in communities that don't speak English, that don't have access to that information. And I think it's really important to kind of understand those cultural differences where even if, they really know I would also like to add that in this particular situation, the tenant is Thai, the landlord is not Thai, but the manager is Thai. And so a lot of times we have people of the same culture that are harassing and taking advantage of other people of the same culture. And that might not necessarily be known by the landlord. So there's other things that happen kind of behind the scenes, and tenants a lot of times are deathly afraid to speak their mind and let people know what's happening because they're afraid that they're going to get kicked out on the street, because they literally told her she would get kicked out on the street and she did not know about the eviction process at all. I could get the next slide. So this is just one example of who is facing housing insecurity in California. Now, this person, she's someone that doesn't speak English very well. She is a person of color. She doesn't have any access to information. So it's really important that we get this information out as well. Next slide. So we see that there is a patchwork of different responses to protect tenants in the state of California and federally as well. And I think Dr. Roberts also explained a little bit about how this is something that's meant to help, but we'll see how it really turns out. I'm going to quickly go over the next slide just to save time. Next slide. So we mentioned AB 3088, the Tenant Relief Act. It's very complicated for people, especially people who are not used to reading fine print or people who don't speak English. There's percentages, you have to pay 25%, there's different dates out there. It's really important that advocates can actually get this information out in a digestible way. I see online there are a lot of resources that have sample declarations. I think that's really helpful because then folks can just fill in their particulars and submit it to their landlord. It's a really good way to go about it. But at the same time, this is not full protection, right? So it's a little bit complicated because it also has to do with a conversion of the rent to consumer debt. I think that's also really important because also people won't understand how this is going to affect their credit and whatnot if they can't actually pay their rent. Next slide. So there's also the CDC eviction moratorium. Now this is for renters that can't pay because of COVID or have medical expenses. Now this is another protection, yet again, kind of confusing what's happening And I think on top of that, we also have some local protections. Next slide. So there's about 79 local jurisdictions that enacted their own eviction protections. And, all of these different ordinances have to play well together. And it's really difficult for consumers to understand which ones that they're supposed to abide by, and how that's going to play out once they might actually be in an eviction process, and once they're served way down the road, maybe in February. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap it up, I want to close it and kind of open a conversation, because we talked about what's happening to Californians before COVID, what's happening now because of COVID, and how we can respond to it through an anti-racist lens, because now we know better that this is a point in time where we can make some real change, and all the players want to come together because of this particular time in history where now everybody's eyes are open. And they might have been open before, but nothing happened, right? The laws changed, right, Dr. Roberts? But we're at a point in time where I think there's a lot of people that are actively going to be saying that people of color are really impacted, and we do want to make sure that we are there to make sure that the right thing happens. Nisha, did you want to close with any parting words right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to reiterate, Dr. Roberts described AB 3088 as a stopgap measure, as is the CDC order, as are the ordinances, the local ordinances. So even where we piece them together and we're able to stave off evictions for individuals, they will still have rental debt, because none of these cancel rent, right? And so, and between that and folks just navigating this who may, fall outside of the scope of the protections, the question is, are their lives not worth saving from eviction? This may be an inflection point where we can think, dare I say it, in this forum, but really radically about why it is that we have set up the system the way we have. Does it still serve the communities, who are most vulnerable? Does it serve our community generally to do things the way we've been doing them? And it's can we think about something different? Otherwise, I think we have to prepare for, just to see visibly the outcomes, which will be tents on the street.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Panita and Nisha. They're going to be joined by Dr. Roberts in a moment, as well as Saba Mwine. But first, we're going to ask Ms. Mwine to kind of give us some definitions, some common lexicon, and really help us now focus on the anti-racist or the racial justice lens. I want to introduce Ms. Mwine. She has over 16 years of experience spearheading projects throughout our nation that measure, investigate, and enforce equal access to housing based on multiple protected classes. Ms. Mwine has played numerous roles, from project designer and civil rights investigator to management consultant and educator. She has been with the Corporation for Supportive Housing since 2017, where she established their first race equity efforts via fundraising, grant programming, and trainings. At CSH, she develops original content on the intersections of race, homelessness, and housing, advises and directs regional race equity initiatives, including the Los Angeles Race Equity Internship, the Connecticut Race Equity Collaborative, and multiple CSH supportive housing institutes across the country. I'm going to turn it over now to Saba.
Thank you so much, Judge Yu, for that warm introduction. And I am just so honored to be joined and together in community with each of my co-panelists. And I really want to extend an appreciation for presenting the data and history context that's really going to provide a proper sort of container for what I'm about to share. So if I could just have my slides come up, please. Thank you. I only have 4 slides. But I just, like Judge Yu said, I want to ground us in this concept of what it means to take an anti-racist approach. And so that's a term that I think is sort of part of the lexicon of this current zeitgeist that we're in, that Panita, you know, and Nisha brought to the fore so well. And it's a term from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be a Racist. And basically, he tells us that an anti-racist is one who is supporting anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. And he really gives us a broad definition for what policy can mean. He says it's any measure that produces or sustains racial equity between racial groups. And then when he says anti-racist idea, he's telling us that it's an idea that suggests that racial groups are equals and that there's not anything wrong with one racial group. And then in fact, anti-racist ideas come from racist policies that we heard about many of them already in our time together today. So basically what he's saying is that we have to take active roles in dismantling racism through our actions and through our ideas. So let's continue to ground ourselves in some of these concepts that will help us to do that will help us to take those actions and express those ideas. Next slide, please. So I just, you know, want us to kind of ground ourselves in the concept of intersectionality, but first let's talk about identity. So as we've heard already, we know that American policies have created racialized poverty and oppression in our society since the Native American genocide and chattel slavery. And so basically those activities have systemic and interpersonal dimensions in our society. And those dimensions preference certain identities in order initially to maintain power among those holding those identities. But we see that even that initial concept has, as Dr. Roberts laid out so eloquently for us, is still very present in our society. So if you look to the right, you'll see some of those mainstream identities that our society deems more valuable. And so that's what's really meant by that rallying cry, Black Lives Matter, is that Black lives have value in our society. And it's a cry for that, because that's not what we've seen throughout the course of our entire history. And in fact, our society was built to ensure the success of those holding those mainstream identities. Whereas marginalized identities experience oppression at the hands of systems. We've heard many examples of that already today with the disproportionality in COVID and homelessness. And you know, but I want to say too that most of us hold both mainstream and marginalized identities. So I want to offer a practice that we can all take to kind of reflect on how we are sort of moving this concept of power as it pertains to identity along in our personal lives, right? So, so an exercise that we can take, if you imagine power being in the central part of this figure, you can ask yourself, well, what's my social location to power? And I recommend that people journal about it. And I want to note too that context matters, like where your body is in space matters. So for example, right now, I am speaking to you as among these esteemed co-panelists, as sort of like an educator. And so I feel like I'm holding a more mainstream and powerful identity. Whereas when I'm driving and I get pulled over by the police, that doesn't happen a lot, thankfully. But you know, I do feel that then the identities that I'm holding that are presenting in that situation are more so my marginalized identities, right? So it's really good for us to kind of like, as you move through your day, to kind of gain an awareness of that. Like, what am I holding? Is a mainstream identity preeminent right now in this interaction that I'm having? And so to get back to the definition of intersectionality. So basically, and Nisha covered it really well too. Basically, it's the idea, it's when people are holding multiple marginalized identities. And when that happens, then the outcomes are compounded. The experience of racialized oppression and trauma are compounded. And so, like Nisha mentioned, like trans Black women are a really experience oppression at all hands and violence at all, from really across the board, multiple systems. And so it's important for us to understand that. And Kimberly Crenshaw is the one that coined this term, and she's really a leading scholar on critical race theory in our country. So BIPOC holding intersectional, and sorry, BIPOC is another kind of zeitgeist term too. So that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Many of you may have been hearing that term. So BIPOC holding intersectional identities experience more acutely systemic and racialized trauma. Next slide, please. So what is racialized trauma? I think many of us know the conventional definition of trauma, where it's a physiological experience that exceeds your coping capacity. It can be acute, but then it could also be chronic events. Whereas racialized trauma is complex trauma. That means it's ongoing with no end. You have the identity of your body that's kind of putting you in the position of experiencing trauma, no matter where you kind of go, especially the trauma of anti-Black racism, which is very severe. And so basically, people that are holding intersectional marginalized identities are experiencing conventional trauma as well as racialized trauma. So that's really important for us to understand in the context of this definition of intersectionality. And so racial trauma is a bodily experience, like I said earlier, in that it's like literally your body, that's the marker. But then it's also a phenomenon that is physiologically held in your body and in your lineages. So this concept of intergenerational trauma has quite a lot of significance in the conversation that we're having today with regards to evictions and how Black and Indigenous people especially have experienced generations of trauma around housing and land theft and labor theft. So the thing about racial trauma is that it traps people in the fight, flight, or freeze response, where your body is literally releasing adrenaline and cortisol. And so because of the legacy of the ongoing legacy of state-sponsored violence against BIPOC, it's pretty safe to say that when litigants of color are walking into your courtroom, they're experiencing a heightened fight, flight, freeze response because of racial trauma. So how do we move forward with this knowledge? Next slide, please. So we can think to address racial trauma by practicing trauma-informed care principles. So trauma-informed care is an evidence-based practice. It understands and considers the pervasive nature of trauma, and it promotes healing environments so as not to re-trigger, re-traumatize people. And so I'm inviting us to use these principles as a practice in our everyday. So I'll just briefly cover them. So safety, how can you promote safety with your actions and words for litigants in the context of the physical space and their emotional state? How can you provide them choice and a sense of control over what is happening to them and what they're experiencing? And then how can you build mutuality and a sense of shared power through collaboration? Also, trustworthiness. How can you use transparency to help build a sense of trustworthiness in your actions and choices? And then lastly, empowerment through validation and affirming people's strengths. So I just want to offer this as like, you know, you can kind of like make it a fun thing by, like, say, for example, at the beginning of your day, you decide, okay, I'm going to practice safety today. I'm going to practice this one principle today and see what I can do to create safety for the people that are coming into or coming to interact with me or coming into the courthouse. And you could even pick a buddy, like if you have a colleague, where you can both practice the same principle and then have the opportunity to kind of reflect on it together. And also, you know, as you're doing so, reflect on your own experience of how you're, you know, observing and seeing things. Mindfulness practices will really help to build that kind of personal awareness. And it's the same types of practices that I promote in my work in training and creating curricula to help people to become aware of their own implicit biases. So if you have a mindfulness practice like breathing and meditation, it'll really help you to be present with yourself and to be present with your thoughts and actions. And so we'll be hearing more ideas about how to practice these kinds of principles from during the rest of our conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Saba. That's great. And what you said really resonated with me. You know, I don't know if it's because we're wearing masks now more and we can't read each other's cues, or what, but I know that for myself, I feel like I'm just vibrating higher because there's so many things going on and I get more exhausted, which I'm sure all of you are working with your clients and population. And I notice that litigants coming in are just more easily triggered. So we are running a little short on time, but I wanted to just check in with Panita, Nisha, Saba, and Dr. Roberts and ask you this question. What approach would you recommend for those people who are working with tenants or landlords who are dealing with the eviction, the pandemic, and all those issues along with the racial trauma? So it's okay if I start with Panita?
Sure, sure. Thanks, Saba, for your presentation. I found it really helpful. And a couple things that I would recommend, especially for people who you're working with that are not from your culture, is really to remember cultural humility, which, as opposed to cultural competence, it's something where you come from a space where you know that you actually will never be competent in that person's background or, you know, share those lived experiences with them. But it's out there, it's said and done, and you can move forward from that point, and the person you're working with will respect you more for it, and not feel like they're kind of being spoken down to. And this also relates to a little bit of the concepts of empathy versus sympathy, where you empathize with someone's experiences rather than sympathizing or you know, kind of showing pity for that person because of their you know, whatever bad luck they might have come across. But I would really start from there because it's really about making those connections with people and their experiences to move forward from that point.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. And I'm going to shift the question somewhat because we got a question from one of our audience. So I'm asking, what advice would you give to people who are working with this population? And the question is shifting in that it's what conversations should come next after the moratorium expires and we're dealing with race and trauma. So it's essentially the same question, but the focus is what happens after the moratorium when you're dealing with people in the throes of all of this. So I'll go with Tanisha next.
Sure. I think it's hard to say because we don't know what comes next, right? And I think we have to sit with people to know that they're looking to us for some kind of guidance. So, you know, I think the same principles apply just to like give people the benefit of your time and attention. We work in an area that is extremely fast-paced. Deadlines are very fast. We have high caseloads. If you're doing eviction defense or working on as a tenant counsel, doing tenant counseling, but it's always important to try to slow down and give the benefit of time and attention to really focus in on what people need, and also to disrupt your own bias. Because even if you come from the same community as your client, because of that sort of positional authority, I think that as Saba mentioned, really knowing where you stand in terms of being your identity vis-a-vis that client, it's still important to try to slow down and disrupt any kind of bias, so you're not just getting frustrated with the individual. I know that doesn't fully answer that question as to how to counsel people as things come next, but we also don't know what comes next, right?
Yeah, you're right. And I think that's a really good answer. And because we don't know what comes next. And part of what we'll talk about later this afternoon in the next half hour is what can courts do, which is a little bit about what happens when the moratorium's lifted. And there are definitely cases going on now. And then the questioner also clarified that she is thinking more about a conversation of the changing laws. But that wasn't really in our focus today. And we had envisioned this symposium might be a two-parter. So that might be the second part. And then I'll go to Dr. Roberts for his answer. What advice would you give to people working with this population? And then we'll go to Saba after. But Dr. Roberts, what advice would you give to people?
I think the first thing I would say, and this comes out of something I've learned early in my clinical experience, you really have to start where the person is when they show up in front of you. And you have to be willing to be honest and open with that person about who you are. And that is the bedrock of a beginning relationship. And I think it's through the vehicle of a relationship that some answers might be found. No guarantee, but at least the person will know that you've tried your best. And that often is worth a lot more than you might think. I remember talking to Brian Stevens, who is the executive director of the project Getting People Off Death Row. And his very first case, he got late in the game. The man was sentenced to die. There was no hope for him in terms of the law. He was going to die. And Brian didn't know what to do, but the prisoner himself said to Brian, look, I know the truth. I'm not ignorant about what's going to happen, but your being here is helpful to me. So I want you to feel comfortable being, and you holding the knowledge that I'm going to die. Don't let that destroy you. And I thought, wow, that's very powerful, because you can extrapolate from that. And as you sit with people who are facing very dire circumstances, there may be nothing you can do to change those circumstances, but you can be a fellow human being in that moment and let them know that you really care about them and see what happens from there.
That's great advice. You touched on two things. One is be where people are, and there's a practice of motivational interviewing. I'm in drug court right now, and so you use motivational interviewing to meet people where they are so you can move them forward. But really, the concept of empathy is so important, and that's actually something that Judge Uhas, Bonnie, and I were going to talk about in terms of what court staff and bench officers can do, because there are studies that indicate that if you are able to display and be empathic in a genuine sense, it actually helps you not suffer from burnout, and it is so powerful in terms of an intervention and in that relationship with the person you're serving. So the next question is for Saba. I'm going to turn it a little bit in that, Saba, what advice will you give to people who are working with this population? And an audience question is, how do I take care of myself so that I don't get triggered as a practitioner? And we know that you will be posting some resources online, because there's another question of, can you give us some resources? So Saba, these questions are for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I really love that question about how can I care for myself. I think the concept of self-care became sort of indoctrinated by dominant white culture, when really it was a concept that the Black Panthers brought to us. And it's really self-care for Black, Indigenous, POC is really an act of racial healing. And I think Audre Lorde said something about that for her as a Black queer woman, it's a radical act for her to care for herself. So it's that thing of like, you know, when you're in an airplane, which I know many of us haven't been in an airplane for a while now, but where it's like you as a person of color also have to first make sure you're taking care of yourself and you have your oxygen mask on when you go to work with other people who are maybe sharing your racialized identity. And I think it's important for us to note as well that the importance of representative leadership. So that when you say walk into a courtroom, you see someone that looks like you. And I just don't want us to underestimate the importance of that and how we have to continue to advocate for Black, Indigenous, POC leadership in every sphere, because that's part of the problem. That's what we're suffering from as a society, is that we don't have enough of leadership who are holding marginalized identities and really bring that to the fore. And I think, you know, probably the other thing that I'll add is to really continue to educate yourself if you are not, you know, no matter what racial identities you're holding, continue on the path of understanding that and unpacking that for yourself. It really all starts with you. Because if you can gain a working understanding of how you're contributing to the system that we're interfacing with as an American society, then we can make different choices. And then eventually those choices will add up. But it's not gonna start from a place of separating ourselves from the real understanding of how we are, in fact, a part of this system. And that may be internalized oppression, or it may be an internalized sense of superiority that was delivered to us by our society. So we really need to continue to unpack that for ourselves in order to have a macro impact, I believe.
Thank you. And I really think that self-care is so important right now because we are all vibrating in a different way, in a much it's a much harsher world right now. So we're shifting gears now to look at what the courts can do. What can court staff do? What can judges do? And I'm going to turn over the moderating responsibilities to Panita. And we're going to start off with Bonnie Huff, but I know Panita will introduce her.
Thank you, Judge Yu. Yeah, so now we're going to shift a little bit. I'd like to introduce Bonnie Huff. She is a principal managing attorney with the Center for Families, Children, and the Courts of the Judicial Council. She manages the Equal Access Fund, the Sergeant Shriver Civil Counsel Act Pilot Project, California's Courts Self-Help Centers, and the Violence Against Women Education Project. I've attended lots and lots of meetings with Bonnie. I feel that she brings a wealth of information with her, and I'm super happy to have her today. I believe Chair of our commission, Judge Mark Uhas, is also joining this panel. And I'll go ahead and introduce him as well. He is a judge of the Los Angeles Superior Court with a general family law assignment, in which capacity he served since November 2002. He is a member of several committees of the LA Superior Court and has chaired the Court's Access and Fairness Committee. And he has a great sense of humor.
Thank you.
Welcome, Judge Uhas.
So we might want to put up Bonnie's slides.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
I appreciate that. So thank you so much. I'm honored and delighted to be part of this group. And one of the things that I think courts can do is provide information, provide support, and help people understand, because I think understanding and knowledge is part of the power that we need to give to everyone in our system. So one of the things that we've done with the California courts is to expand information on our self-help center, which is available to everybody 24/7, which is always nice, both with the emergency court actions and just general information. One of the things you'll note is that the entire site, our entire self-help site, is translated into Spanish, which is, I think, a really critical resource for many certainly brown people in our community, and other resources. We don't have as many resources translated into other languages, but certainly we have a mirror site in Spanish, as well as immigration and other kinds of resources. If you could advance the slide, that would be great. Thanks. And I wanted to just also say, one of the things I'm really proud of in California is that we have self-help centers in every county and every court that help people navigate the system and provide information and assistance. And so we have this little map as a way for people who relate to spatial explanations about where they are to be able to find that information. But again, a wide variety of information, and then partnerships with people like law librarians who also can provide great resources. So if you could go to the next slide, be really helpful. Okay, so obviously our focus is on eviction and housing, and that is a really critical piece. And I am proud that we've been able to do this because our site is really well used. We have over 4 million people a year come to the self-help center. Some of them more often than that, but it's over 4 million individual users each year. So it's a way to get information out for people. So if you could go to the next slide, as you see, what we've done is talked about the new laws that relate to eviction cases, and talked about AB 3088. And next slide. Also the CDC orders. And then we have new and revised forms that are effective October 5th. The AB 3088 was passed August 31st, and we were able to get these forms done quite quickly, which is way beyond what we're normally able to do. And the downside is that we don't have the great comment period that we're usually able to have, which allows us to really, vet it, have a lot of discussion. These are all these statutes are incredibly complicated for lawyers, let alone people without lawyers. And so I think everybody is working through doing the best that they can through this period, but we have information about all of that and the forms. If I could have the next slide. So we focused on both help and resources for tenants as well as for landlords, because we know we're the court system. We try to provide information and assistance for everyone. Okay, the next slide. So one of the things that we've done is a checklist for tenants to help them understand what their opportunities are under both the AB 3088 as well as the CDC, and also noting that local ordinances apply, as I think Panita described earlier. And next slide. And we've done the same thing for landlords so that they understand their rights and responsibilities as well. And next slide. So one of the things that we did, and I think one of the exciting things about this time, I mean, we're all looking for the silver lining out of these challenges, is that the executive office executive department is also really looking at ways to provide assistance to help address the issues of homelessness and to provide information to people. So the Bureau of the Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency worked with the Department of Real Estate to put together this resource called Housing is Key, and we collaborated with them on this. And one of the things that they did is a half-an-hour class focused, one for tenants, one for landlords, on how 3088 works. But the idea is to train community agencies, to train food bank workers, church, clergy, other people who are the helpers in the community, so that they understand the basics of the law and understand where they can refer people to get assistance. And that is available in both English and Spanish. And they've put together some really nice resources because, again, just calculating your AMI under the law to understand, are you at an income level where AB 38 applies or not, is fairly challenging, but they've developed this nice little calculator. But again, I think the idea of us all collaborating and thinking about how we provide the most assistance is really critical. So if you could advance, next slide. So again, they have information for landlords because there are many small landlords who are really struggling in this time. As Judge, you indicated initially, we're certainly focusing on tenants, but landlords also need to know what they can't do and how to be acting legally and appropriately during this time. And the next slide, please. As we discussed earlier, there are sample declarations for tenants to complete to explain their situation and to provide notice to the landlord that they are unable to meet their financial obligations as a result of COVID-19. And those have been translated into at least 5 languages. And I know legal service agencies are also translating into others, but this is the official state declaration, which is really useful. The next slide. This is the form, one of the forms that we put together in a month to provide information for folks. And this is for the plaintiff, for the landlord, to be able to make the additional and provide the additional information under AB 3088 to indicate that it is proper for them to move forward with an eviction. In the next slide. And then a cover sheet so that the defendant, the tenant, can attach that declaration that they did or some other indication that they provided the landlord that they were unable to meet the obligations, so that they can provide that information to the court in a way that can easily be filed by the court. Next slide. And so this is again for the tenant to be able to say, I'm not able to meet my obligations because of these challenges, so that they can use this, this form as well. And next slide. The other thing that we've been doing are developing what are called, well, we use a term, law help interactive programs, but they're kind of document assembly. So TurboTax for the law that help people, they ask questions, and then as you answer the questions, it just fills in the forms for you, which can be really helpful when the forms are complicated. And we, work to try to put it in more plain English than some of the we're able to do with some of the forms. So next slide. And so that we've already been able to accomplish that for the complaint and the answer in unlawful detainer or eviction cases. Still, it is a complicated thing to work on, but continuing to develop those. And at the Judicial Council, much of our work is really focused on helping the helpers, the legal services agencies and self-help centers, be able to complete these forms more quickly, but they can also be used by tenants and landlords themselves. Next slide. The other great resource, of course, is Law Help California, which is the legal services website that we link to and encourage people to review. It has information about that it's been developed more by legal services programs and on eviction process. And next slide. The other great thing that we do is, and the statewide website is linking to this, is you can say, this is where I'm located, this is my type of problem, and here, this is housing evictions, and it lists what legal aid agencies are available in your community, as well as self-help centers and other nonprofit legal services programs that provide assistance. So there are just a lot of resources that are available. And again, part of the goal is to share that wealth of information to help people get the guidance they need to be able to protect their own rights. And I think that is one critical thing we can do. The other and legal and court staff can absolutely be referring to these, can let people know we're trying to get that information out. I know that a number of self-help center people would love to be here, but they have 2 conflicting classes at the same time today. So I'm so glad this is being recorded. And we, for example, were able to have Madeline Howard from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, who provided training to us 4 days after the law passed, which was just incredibly helpful, because many people, when they get a court document or they're concerned, are going to go to court to get help and assistance. And often for a low-income landlord, the only place that they're really able to get assistance is going to be from the self-help center. So I think those are some really critical resources, but you can get to all of them from the California Court Self-Help website, or we all try to interlink with each other to make sure that there's no wrong door to get assistance and help.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I definitely need to brush up on the website there. Now we're going to have a panel discussion between Bonnie, Judge Yuhas, Saba, and Judge Yu. And I'm going to kick it off by starting with the question, how can the court system provide a trauma-informed court experience, specifically addressing racial trauma?
Would you like to go first?
You go ahead, Judge Yu.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know time is short, so I'm going to talk more about sort of like specifics in the courtroom and remote hearings, because I think a lot of the courts are having remote hearings, and when these unlawful detainer cases start coming into court in large numbers, we still may be doing some remote hearings. There's of course things you can do in the courtroom. So an example is, when I first moved into a department during a year that I was doing an experiment in Santa Clara County, where I had all the civil unlawful detainer cases, all the civil self-represented litigant cases. I moved into the largest department there was in our system. And basically it was like walking into the barricades at Les Miserables, because there's like chairs, tables everywhere, and on purpose, where the judge was trying to keep people away. So we moved all that, opened up the space, put a table on the side with a lot of forms in different colors, so that I could help the self-represented litigants identify what form would be useful for them. But in a remote hearing, what we're finding is that a lot of people don't have access to the internet. As our guide said, they don't have smartphones, they don't know how to use them, they don't even know how to mute their phones. And so we've moved to time certain calendaring, where people are given 15-minute slots, and they don't have to use all their minutes while they're waiting, and they don't have to use all their battery, because several of our people in drug court, as you may expect, are homeless. They cannot keep their phones charged. I also created a charging station in my courtroom, so people who are homeless or don't have access to reliable electricity can charge their phones while they're in the courtroom waiting. We're trying to sort of see things from other people's perspective. Just if I could have the slide that is about procedural fairness and justice displayed. Just as we train judges to do, which Judge Yuhas and I do a lot of, is we want to make sure that people understand that as a judge and as a court staff member, our primary responsibility is and goal is to achieve procedural fairness and justice. And these are the concepts, but they actually dovetail really well with the concepts that Saba talked about, which is safety, choice, which is control, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. And so basically, I try to put myself in the other person's shoes. If I always ask, if they're calling in remotely, can you see us or can you only hear us? And if they can only hear us, I say who's in the courtroom, because I find when people are disoriented, that it's very hard for them to take in information and respond to the judge's questions or the lawyer's questions. I also, after one case is heard, if I hear people chiming in on another remote, I'll say, thank you for joining us. I want you to know we have about 6 more cases in front of you. So if you want to stay on the line, that's great. But if you're worried about your minutes and your data, you can call back in 15 minutes. So there's a sense of control. In terms of racial justice, I think it's so important, the work that has been done in the last, since 2006, when the Judicial Council convened its first conference in San Jose on judicial diversity. Since 2006, there's just really been great strides made in the state with a much more diverse bench. And I think that's extremely important, where people walk in and they see someone that kind of looks a little familiar and they feel safe. And then finally, before I turn it over to someone else, I think safety is so important. You know, I've had a brother who was at the dog park and really accosted by someone who accused him of bringing the coronavirus to this country. When I walk my dog around, you know, I always smile at people, and now sometimes people are just like glaring at me and kind of like not smiling back. And I think, I wonder what's going on, and am I really feeling safe? Since 2016, there's just been so much more information about racism in this country that I just wasn't aware of. And also, as a judge, a person who is privileged, I'm sort of immune to some of that, or at least protected. So it really made me feel kind of really aware of my safety and the safety of others. So those are just some thoughts. Panita, who would you like to turn
Thank you.
to?
Judge Yuhas, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think from the perspective of a trial court, I think I'm going to sort of key off of what Judge Yu just said for just a moment. I think it's important that we all learn about what's going on. Stay up on what's going on in the society. Go beyond just the headlines that you see in the paper or the little sound bites that you see on Twitter or whatever. I think that understanding what is being discussed and how that's affecting people that are coming into our courtrooms become really important. But also, I think at the end of the day, in any court, there is often a result that is not going to go well for the tenant, and or not going to go well for the landlord. I mean, it's not going to go well for one party or the other. I suspect, I've never sat in an unlawful detainer court, but I'm assuming that more often than not, it does not go well for the tenant. And so I think how the judge conducts the court can be so incredibly important. And I think the judge being human, being present, there's a lot going on. It's a busy court, but paying attention to the tenant, to the litigants that are there, being honest and saying, you know, this is the result, this is the law, making people understand that the judge is actually making decisions based on what the law is, explaining the law, making understanding the transparency on this slide. Those kinds of things can make such a difference in the way that the tenant then is able to go on after receiving the bad news. I think also, Judge, you talked a little bit about knowing what resources are available. You know, it's not giving someone legal advice to say, you can go to the self-help center, you can go to the website, you can you can call this community-based organization, you can talk to this legal aid association, you can do all sorts of different things. That's not giving legal advice, and understanding the difference between legal advice and non-legal advice becomes so key. And then finally, you know, I'll turn it over to Saba or someone else. I think if you take a little bit of extra time with each of the litigants, and it's hard to do on an impacted, busy calendar, but if you take a little bit of time and find out, is this person a victim of domestic violence? Is this person in a different place with a different lived experience? Those kinds of things can become so incredibly important to what the judge can say and how the judge can, in those discretionary calls, make decisions under the law. So I think just, you know, being culturally humble, being humble, you know, understand the role and the power of language and how you deliver things and what you do can be so incredibly important. So having said that, I will turn it over to Saba or whoever's next.
Sure. Saba, do you have anything to add?
Just real quickly, I will, because I'm so interested in hearing other answers to this question. It's such a great one. But I just want to underscore something that Judge Yu had said about asking litigants in the context of virtual hearings, like, can you see me? Can you hear me? As a form of almost a grounding practice. Or not almost, it is actually a grounding practice. And so to kind of, I think that's something that lawyers can, in terms of building the relationship with the tenant, can really think about as a great practice. And I think, Panita, you had even mentioned, or I can't remember what call it was that we were on in planning, and if it was the discussion that we were having around families and making sure that you have like coloring books and crayons available, and even like for adults, that practice of coloring is extremely grounding. And when I mean grounding, I mean basically an act that will take you out of sort of the spiral that you experience when you're in that fight or flight mode. So I always like to use this as an example. This is a little crystal that I have at my desk. And for me, it acts as sort of a grounding, you know, it keeps me in, it keeps me present. Like Judge Juhas was saying, like being really present with people. You can do breathing exercises to do that. And I want to lift something that actually Judge Juhas had said during one of our planning calls, which was so important and profound to me, that judges are in service. They are in service to the community. And if you take that approach in your work, I think is really, it's a very powerful way to balance power in the role that you're in and in the one that you're taking. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Saba. Bonnie, did you have anything to add?
I guess briefly, yes. But our Chief Justice, who we're so lucky to have, Justice Kantil Sakauwe, who spoke to us the other day and talked about needing three things through this pandemic. One is gratitude, grace, and grit. And I think in many ways, grace is about empathy. And I think all of us just really need to be mindful of all the challenges that people are facing right now. I mean, we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with an economic fallout as a result of that, and then we're dealing with racism that's just being pushed in our face in just an incredible way. And I think of a friend who has a 30-year-old son who is tall and strong and Black and autistic, and she's scared to death. She's scared to death that he's going to have an encounter with police. And thinking about, and then if she was also coming to court dealing with an eviction, there is just only so much, right, that we can all contain. And I just think we just need to be thinking about that as we work with each other. And we also need to recognize that court staff are also in many ways facing some of these challenges right now. The courts have taken a 10% cut, which means that many of us are on furlough. They're, courts, which, cutting into salaries and things like that. So I would also ask that the legal services folks and people who are interacting with the courts also be mindful, because the reality is none of us know all the challenges that we're all facing. And so I think, I'm thinking about that in terms of grace and just moving forward. And I think the other piece is sort of affirming. When someone comes to court as a self-represented litigant who doesn't have it quite right, to just say, wow, this is really complicated stuff and you're doing a great job. Let's see how we can help you get your papers filed, or how we can move forward with things. Or no worries, this is confusing, we get it. Something like that, because you're not going to be able to say, hope you win, or, that's not exactly a neutral response. But being able to just, again, be in empathy and holding that kindness is something, again, that we may not be able to fix the situation in terms of them being able to find housing, but we can be human and decent and caring. And sometimes that makes a huge difference.
Can I add something, Anita? may I add something? So what we also do, and when I had the unlawful detainer calendar, is we work in partnership with community agencies, which I know your agencies already do or can do. So we would give out lists of places where people can go get resources for housing, for food, for tattoo removal, for getting an Obama phone or whatever it was. We would always hand that out so people would feel more empowered and realize we care. I go to the dollar store and make care packages for people, which have some snacks in it and hygiene products. And it's not a big, it's not a big deal for me to do that, but it makes such a big difference in terms of empowerment and showing litigants that you care. And then I keep some toys and kids books around, and I get things from First Five, which has funding for that. And it makes such a difference. You see people who are really sad, just literally, I mean, no other word but sad. And their children are sitting there with them in the courtroom. And then I say, oh, your child, how old is your child? And, spend a little time, and they've been so good. So I have this little, whatever it is, Lego set or dolly or book, and I give it to the deputy, and the deputy is able to take it down there. And the smile on the child is infectious for everyone in the courtroom. So there's just really a lot of things one can do to humanize the experience, whether one is dealing with this stuff or not, but it really is important at this time, I think.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm going to move on to the next question. What approach would you recommend for court staff working with people who face eviction and who are also experiencing racial trauma?
I'm going to ask if Judge Juhas can answer that and then close this out, because it's 2:29.
Right, there you go. So I was just going to say that we are we're bumping up against our time, and I want to be kind to everybody's time. So very briefly, I think that Bonnie really sort of said anything I would say in that regard. That that court staff is being trained. Court staff is is sensitive to these issues, and I think that all of us on this side of the court, if you will, are doing the best we can to understand that we don't know what's actually going on in any one individual's life. And so being as kind and human and respectful as we can. Having said that, I would like to close very briefly with sort of one quick recollection and then one giant thank you. I went to a wedding a number of years ago in Colorado, and it was in a very small mountain church, and along the wall was painted, "Grace is for everyone, or it isn't grace." And I think that that's really important to keep in mind. And as we all go into whatever's going to happen next, it's not all clear what's going to happen next, but whatever's going to happen next, just keeping in mind that having that grace can be so critically important to not only you, enlightened self-interest, but more to the litigant that's going to be faced with problems as a result of interfacing with the court system. So. But having said that, I would really like to thank Judge Kolakowski for doing such an excellent job at the helm of making the technology work.
Oh, Jasmine.
And to Jasmine, who really, I guess, was at the helm, and for doing all of this. I would also like to thank Judge Yu and Panita for the concept, the idea for putting this together, getting all of the speakers together, and all of that. Dr. Roberts, a special thanks for you for taking time out of your day, for making the comments that you made, and I think setting the stage so very beautifully. I would also just like to say thanks to all of you that have attended on behalf of not only the commission, but the racial, I never get this right, the Racial Justice and Intersectionality Committee, and as Judge Yu said, if you're going to fill out your evaluation, please do, and put on it what would you like to see next. What if you were designing a seminar or something along those lines like this, what topics would you like to see covered? So, having said that, I think Judge Kolakowski, I will turn it over back to you, or Jasmine, or whoever I'm turning it back over to.
I think it's Jasmine. She might have some final announcements.
Okay, very good. Jasmine?
And she has posted some things in the chat.
Yeah, well, I just posted in the chat for anyone that has any questions, you can email me. My email address is jcadora@calatj.org. And also I posted in the chat that all materials and this video recording will be posted to our website, and I dropped the link, but you can also find it on our website under resources and then go to the after the moratorium tab. And that's all I have. So
And
thank
to
you for joining.
Ashton Cooper, sorry we didn't get to your question, but thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.